Hello trainers and welcome to another lesson on catching in Pokemon Go PvP. Today we'll talk about strategies that you can use to make it harder for opponents to catch your moves. So if things like this keep happening to you and you want to know what you can do to make these situations look more like that, you're on the right place. The first important thing to note here is that preventing catches and catching moves has the same fundament, and that is recognizing predictable timings. So if you want to make a catch, you typically make the assumption that your opponent will just throw with predictable timing and make the catch attempt just then. If you want to avoid a catch from your opponent, you also recognize those predictable timings and just avoid throwing at that timing to avoid the catch. And we'll also cover today what those predictable timings are briefly, but if you want the details on that topic, I recommend checking out my previous video where we talked about that. But the focus today will be what you can do to avoid those predictable timings. Now you might think, hey, if I can recognize what a predictable timing is, all I have to do is just go one fast move over and I already avoid the catch. And yes, for the most part, that is completely true. If you recognize that throwing immediately is predictable and you also recognize you can overfarm at least by one fast move, you will already avoid a vast majority of catch attempts. And there's even more good news. You don't need to be fully aware of your window of opportunity of how much you could overfarm to be able to do this. All you need to know is that you can overfarm at least by one fast move. Then you can already avoid throwing immediately. So where's the catch? Why is this another 20-minute video? And the first issue here is that sometimes you simply can't overfarm because you and your opponent reach a charge move at the same time. So your window of opportunity is only one turn or one fast move long. In which case you need to make a plan. Do I throw immediately or do I not throw immediately? Quick note here is that if you want to learn about waiting a turn to prevent catches, we'll be covering that in a separate video because waiting a turn is really a topic on its own. The next thing to keep in mind here is that when both you and your opponent are at a fairly high skill level, your opponent will probably not go for the catch attempt immediately if you have a fairly high window of opportunity. So we'll also talk about what do. You anticipate a catch attempt, but you keep doing fast moves and your opponent also keeps doing fast moves. But at some point you will need to throw your charge move. And one final thing is that's also important for catches, even if you do avoid the catch attempt, so your opponent swaps a Pokemon, you do another fast move, you still need to have a strategy. What do you do with the new Pokemon? So it's also something we'll have to talk about. And we'll start with the uncomfortable situation that you have a very small window of opportunity this time. So your window of opportunity is either one turn long because you reach a move at the same time as your opponent, but you have a higher attack stat, or one fast move long because you reach the charge move one fast move before your opponent, but you have a lower attack stat. And these situations are pretty uncomfortable because you kind of have to throw immediately, because if you don't and your opponent doesn't go for the catch, they can throw their charge move first and then you are in a pretty bad situation. However, if you do throw immediately and your opponent goes for the catch, you're also in a bad situation because you waste all of your energy. And first, the bad news here is there is no solution that can fix all of the problems here. However, there are a couple of things you might want to consider that can help you to form a better decision in those situations. And we'll actually start with an excursion about baits here because the situation is very similar if you think about it. So if your opponent might go for a bait and you have to make a shielding decision, there are essentially four potential outcomes. You can go for the shield or you can go for the no shield, and your opponent can go for the bait or not go for the bait. And yeah, this makes a decision matrix of four possible outcomes. You can't control what your opponent will do, but you can control if you go for the shield or not. And if it's at the end of the game and your opponent reaches one nuke and one bait move, it's essentially a 50-50 decision, because if you shield the nuke correctly, you win. If you don't, you lose. And yeah, essentially of those four fields, 2 lead to victory and 2 lead to defeat. If it's early in the game, it's more complicated typically, and you have to think about it, what might be the better overall outcome here. So for example, if you already got a shield from your opponent, you might think, okay, if I no shield a bait, I'm in a great situation. If I no shield a nuke, I'm still in a good situation because I already have a shield advantage. If, however, your opponent throws a potentially KOing charge move first and you didn't even get a shield from them and they still have plenty of health remaining, no shielding a nuke might be pretty devastating and immediately put you in a losing situation. So in this case, you might be more likely to go for the shield. And essentially deciding whether you want to throw your threatening charge move when your opponent might go for the catch or not, it's essentially the same. You can throw your charge move, you can not throw your charge move, and your opponent can go for the catch or not go for the catch. And just like for baits, if it happens at the end of the game, it's often a 50-50 decision, because If you do throw immediately and your opponent goes for the catch, you lose. If you throw immediately and your opponent does not go for the catch, you win. If you don't throw immediately and your opponent goes for the catch, you win. And if you don't throw immediately but your opponent throws immediately, you lose. So no matter if you throw immediately or not, either decision can immediately lead to victory or defeat. If you're worried about the catch more early in the game, in the lead or on the secondary matchup, it can be a little more complicated. If a catch or not throwing a charge move is more punishing, we'll talk about that just in a moment, but let us focus on the end game situation, what your decision might be here, because even though in terms of the outcome it's a 50-50 decision, in terms of what your opponent is more likely to do, it's often not a 50-50 decision, because if it's obvious to your opponent that you have a very small window of opportunity that you have to throw immediately, most opponents will go for the catch, so you might be much more likely to win if you don't throw your charge move. And this brings us back to recognizing patterns in the playstyle of your opponent. If you recognize they have very good energy management, and you noticed earlier they always throw their charge moves as late as possible, they always try to force CMP and so on, it is very likely that they also recognize at the end of the game that you have to throw your charge move immediately, so they are very likely to go for the catch. If however your opponent might not be aware, maybe they don't even recognize when you reach your charge move, it might be more likely that you just throw immediately because your opponent might not even realize you are at a charge move. So yeah, it's less about what is better for your opponent in terms of strategy, but rather do they recognize that you have to throw immediately or not? Because if they recognize it, they are very likely to go for the catch. If they don't recognize it, they probably won't go for the catch. Next, let's talk about how that matrix might look like if you're worried about a catch more early in the game. And what is better here is much more situational. What you're essentially deciding between is the punishing cases of the matrix. If you throw your charge move immediately and your opponent goes for the catch, you lose your energy for one charge move, which might be pretty bad if you have a Pokemon with very expensive charge moves like Registeel. If you don't throw immediately but your opponent does, you use a shield that you otherwise would not have needed to use. So depending on the situation, that might also be bad or might not be that bad. So there is no general answer what is a better solution here, but there's a rule of the thumb. If you have a matchup that is very alignment based, so for example, if you have a Bastiodon or you know your opponent has a Bastiodon, having alignment is the most important thing in the match. So if your opponent goes for the catch, that's okay, they make you waste some energy, but they switch lock themselves and they give you the alignment that you want, so you might be still in a pretty good spot even if they catch an expensive charge move. If you don't think there's a Pokemon that is very alignment based, a catch can be very punishing if your charge moves are very expensive, so in those situations you might more want to hold on to your energy. Also, if you're in a good spot to begin with, so for example, if you're playing Stunfisk against a Charizard and you successfully called the Dragonclaw bait, I told you in a previous video that for the biggest advantage you would have to throw your second Rock Slide immediately, because otherwise the Charizard reaches a Blast Burn and can throw it before you. However, you already do have a shield advantage, and even if you do shield another Dragonclaw bait, you're still in a pretty good situation because you have a lot of energy. So having to use a shield while still holding onto your Rock Slide might be not that bad. So in those cases, having to shield a move might not be quite as punishing. So you might want to hold onto your energy even if your opponent does not go for the catch. There's also a useful strategy that you can use when you have a higher attack stat than your opponent and you're worried about a catch, and that is storing the charge move and swapping out to a different Pokemon. That is especially useful at the end of the game when a catch once again might be the deciding factor. So you and your opponent are racing to a decisive charge move, you reach it at the same time but you have a high attack stat, and both you and your opponent have a second Pokemon with 1 HP remaining, and you just store the charge move on your current Pokemon and swap out to your 1 HP Pokemon. If you think about it, what are the possible outcomes? The first possible outcome is your opponent also goes for the catch, in which case your catches cancel each other out, you come back in with your healthy Pokemon and you can throw first because you win CMP. If they throw their own charge move, they KO your potential catch Pokemon, you come back in with your healthy Pokemon, they still have their own catch available, however because they wasted their energy, your window of opportunity is now bigger and you don't have to throw immediately anymore. If they do neither, if they stay in and do another fast move, that isn't the best situation because they just KO your potential catch Pokemon with a fast move and you're back in your situation that you have to decide whether you throw immediately or not. However, this is the same situation that you would otherwise be in, because you still have to make the call. Do they go for the catch or do they not go for the catch? So you're not in a worse spot than originally, and that is the worst possible outcome by storing your charge move. So if it's at the end of the game, there is no real downside. Even the worst possible outcome from storing the charge move is the same as if you would decide normally and you don't go for the catch. Of course, this strategy is also possible to use at the beginning, earlier in the game. However, once again, it's much more situational because there are more things you have to think about. What if you swap to a different Pokemon and your opponent swaps to a hard counter, then you're in a tough spot. What if your opponent throws a charge move? How much damage does it deal to the Pokemon you swap in, and so on. So it's still a possible strategy in those cases. However, it's much more situational. So as a first summary here, if you have a very small window of opportunity which forces you to throw your charge move immediately, what you want to do is you want to make a decision matrix in your head. What happens if you throw immediately? What happens if you don't throw immediately? What happens if your opponent goes for the catch? And what happens when your opponent does not go for the catch? If it's end of the game, it's typically a 50-50 decision, which leads to victory or which leads to defeat. If it's earlier in the game, there are more things to think about. And what you also want to do, you want to recognize patterns in your opponent's gameplay to determine if they are more likely to go for the catch or if they are more likely to not go for the catch, because they might not be aware that you already are at a charge move. Now, of course, having to throw immediately is the most uncomfortable situation possible, because these are very awkward and you have to make often a 50-50 call. However, these won't always be the case when you're worried about a catch. More often you will have a window of opportunity that is bigger than only one turn. So what do you do in those cases? And as we've talked about, there are two most predictable timings that you typically want to avoid. That is throwing immediately, because a lot of players will go for the catch just then when it's a decisive charge move, and the other most predictable timing is throwing as late as possible, which a lot of high-level players will go for. So if you can overfarm at least by 2 fast moves because your window of opportunity is big enough to do that, you are in a pretty good spot because you can throw in between those predictable timings. However, there's also the somewhat awkward situation that you have a window of opportunity that is 2 fast moves long. So you either throw immediately or you throw as late as possible, which is after 1 fast move. So this is still pretty awkward because both possible timings that you can go for are somewhat predictable depending on the skill level of your opponent. However, of course, you still have the third option of not throwing your charge move at all because you think your opponent will go for the catch. And once again, if you think about it, in terms of skill levels, most opponents will go for the catch immediately because they will think, okay, that is the most predictable timing, I'll just go for the catch when my opponent reaches the charge move, and if you do another fast move, you will already avoid that. But also, if you think about it on a theoretical level, it's better to not throw immediately, because if we think about the matrix that you just talked about, we can expand that to the case that you have a window of opportunity of 2 fast moves. And if you do throw immediately, there are 2 possible outcomes. If your opponent goes for the catch, you have the worst possible outcome and you're in a rough spot. If you throw immediately and your opponent does not go for the catch, you have the best possible outcome because you landed the charge move on the Pokemon you wanted to land it on. So you either go immediately into the best or into the worst possible outcome. However, if you don't throw immediately, what are the possible outcomes here? If your opponent does go for the catch immediately, you are once again immediately in the best possible situation because you avoided the catch. However, if you don't throw immediately and your opponent also does not go for the catch immediately, this does not put you into the worst situation because you still can make the 50-50 call whether your opponent will go for the catch or not. So strictly on a theoretical level, it's better to not throw immediately, and also in terms of skill levels, more players will go for the catch immediately rather than predicting that you might overfarm by 1. So it's better to not throw immediately, and if your opponent does go for the catch, you immediately avoided the catch. And if your opponent also doesn't go for the catch, you're still in a 50-50 situation, which is not the best situation, but it's also not the worst situation. So how does this all translate to bigger windows of opportunities? And as we've said, you can just throw sometime between the earliest and the latest possible timing, and in most cases this way you will avoid the catch. However, there's also a different way you might think of these situations, and that is that every time you do an extra fast moves, 1 out of 2 things happen. Either your opponent goes for the catch, in which case you immediately avoid it, or your opponent does not go for the catch, in which case your remaining window of opportunity shrinks by 1. So essentially you have a very big decision matrix, and every time you do another fast moves, either you win or the remaining matrix shrinks until at some point you're back into the 50-50 situation that you might or might not want to avoid. So it's kind of comes down to personal preference if you just keep doing fast moves until you have to make a 50-50 call, or if you throw a little earlier. And yeah, my personal opinion is typically if I know that my opponent is perfectly aware of my window of opportunity, I will usually throw at one fast move before the last possible timing. However, one thing to keep in mind here is that if you play against the same opponent multiple times, or if you are in a tournament where your matches are being streamed, even if you have a strategy that you like a lot and you think that is perfectly unpredictable how you throw your charge moves, if you always go for the same unpredictable strategy, that unpredictable strategy becomes predictable. So you want to mix it up to keep being unpredictable. The next topic to talk about is uncertainty. What do you do when you're worried that your opponent might go for catch, but at the same time you're not exactly sure how close they are to their own charge move? And here generally the same principle as for energy management applies. What this does is this creates a perceived window of opportunity that might be bigger or smaller than the actual window of opportunity. And as we've talked about in the beginning, the good thing is as long as you're aware that your window of opportunity is at least 2 fast moves long, you can still avoid a lot of catches by just not throwing immediately. So as long as you're sure your window is at least 2 fast moves long, even if you're not exactly sure if it's 2, 3 or maybe even 5 fast moves, you will avoid most catches. But other than that, what are the effects if you are not exactly sure about your window? And yeah, it's very similar to the general ideas of energy management. If you underestimate your window of opportunity, that makes it a little easier for your opponent to make a catch, because you simply have less opportunities to throw your charge move, which means there are less possible timings your opponent has to worry about where they might make their catch attempt. If you overestimate your window of opportunity, you might get lucky. Your opponent might go for the catch when they are at their own charge move, while you are blissfully unaware that they were at a charge move. But it's also very likely that you might be punished by just getting KO'd and your opponent throwing their charge moves. So yeah, it's very similar to energy management. If you're not exactly sure how big your window of opportunity is, it's safer to underestimate rather than overestimate is. Also, when you think your opponent might be unsure of the energy because, for example, you've made a lot of swaps throughout the game and you're close to the end of the game after 2 or 3 minutes, so it becomes more likely that the catch attempt happens earlier than it would have to. Another situation to be aware of where a catch attempt might happen from your opponent is when your opponent seemingly misses their window of opportunity, especially when you have a higher attack stat. What I mean by that is your opponent already has a charge move stored, you currently don't, but they allow you to reach a charge move. The first possibility is that if it's not at the beginning of the game, but you both switch simultaneously and they are switch locked. In this case, there is really no risk in throwing immediately because the chances are your opponent has miscounted, or they just don't know the counts of Charizard and they thought they could still overfarm more, so you just want to throw immediately to punish your opponent for not knowing the counts. However, if your opponent is not switch locked, they might be wanting to do a catch, and this is once again a situation where you need to make a call. How good do you think your opponent is? Maybe you already recognize patterns in your opponent's gameplay style, so you know if they have good or bad energy management. If you think your opponent is pretty good because either you recognize it in the game or you know your opponent before, chances are they know the count that you reach a blastman after 7 wing attacks, so it's pretty likely that they go for the catch. If, however, your opponent is not that good, it's also possible that they simply don't know the counts of Charizard and want to throw their Rock Slide later. So essentially, we're back to the example we had earlier. It becomes a decision matrix that you have to make a call. What if they go for the catch? What if they go for their own charge move? Just the situation is a little different because you shouldn't be in this situation, because you would typically expect that your opponent would have thrown their own charge move earlier. One last thing to talk about is what do you do when your opponent goes for the catch and you successfully avoid it. So your opponent swaps to a different Pokemon they want to make a catch on, you do another pass move and you see, aha, my opponent went for the catch. I called this the best possible outcome multiple times, but it doesn't immediately mean that you win, because you still have to handle the Pokemon your opponent makes a catch attempt on somehow. And this is pretty easy. When your opponent tries to catch on a Pokemon with very low health, you just KO that with fast moves. and then you can land your charge move on your original target without having to worry about a potential catch anymore. However, this becomes more complicated when it happens on the lead. And often you have enough time to react to the catch attempt, so you just keep doing fast moves while you try to decide what you make a counter swap in. And if you have a pretty hard answer to the Pokemon that your opponent tried to make the catch on, it is pretty fine that you overfarm a little bit on your original Pokemon and took some time to make the counter swap, because you are still able to win that matchup. However, sometimes even if you do have a good answer to the Pokemon your opponent tried to make the catch on, they might be able to flip the matchup if you give them enough energy advantage. One example for this would be Shadow Swampert against Shadow Gligar. This is typically a good matchup for the Shadow Swampert because one Hydro Cannon and a couple of Mudshots is enough to KO. However, if you allow the Gligar to get a small energy advantage of only 2 wing attacks, it is able to flip the matchup in the 2-shield scenario. So if you don't react fast enough, your opponent might be able to punish you for that. So if you're on the lead and you see this is a pretty positive lead for me and my opponent will probably try to make a catch, what you want to do is you want to plan ahead what might your opponent try to catch on. And for this, you often want to think about what are typical team compositions when you see the lead, what are typical backlines for this lead. Also, if you're playing a show 6 pick 3 format, you already know what potential backlines might be. So if you see your opponent is staying in, even before they go for the catch attempt, you want to plan ahead. What counter swap do I make when my opponent catches on this or that Pokemon? This can become even more crucial later in the game. So if your opponent has a potential catch target that is also healthy and also is pretty close to a charge move, even if you are able to avoid the catch attempt, if you don't react quick enough, they are able to reach their own charge move and throw it on you before you are able to make a counter swap. So yeah, it's pretty important to make a plan what you want to do when your opponent might go for a catch. This is pretty difficult at the beginning because you have to think about potential backlines. However, if you've already seen Pokemon of your opponent, or if it's a show 6 pick 3 format, you will have a lot more information available, and that makes it easier to make a good plan what you might want to do when your opponent goes for a catch. So that's it for today. What have we learned? We talked about how you don't want to throw your charge move immediately if you want to avoid the catch, because most opponents will go for the catch attempt immediately, predicting that you will also throw your charge move immediately. So if you are aware that you don't have to throw immediately, you are already able to avoid most catch attempts. So for this, it also doesn't matter if you are perfectly aware how big your window of opportunity is, or if you are slightly unsure, or if it's 2 fast moves long, if it's 5 fast moves long. As long as you know that you don't have to throw immediately, you already avoid the vast majority of catch attempts. If, however, you have a very small window of opportunity, either because it's small to begin with or because you kept doing fast moves expecting your opponent to go for the catch, but they simply don't, you want to think about this situation like a decision matrix. So what if your opponent goes for the catch? What if they don't for the catch? What if you throw, and what if you don't throw your charge move? What is the best possible outcome out of these 4 overall cases? So overall, what have we talked about in the 3 videos? In the first video, we talked about good energy management. In the previous video, we talked about what to do to catch a move yourself. And this time we talked about how to avoid catches. So what is there left to talk about? And as you might remember from the introduction, a catch has 3 components. Those are the prediction, the timing, and the target. So far, all we've talked about is the prediction, because it's the most important and the most difficult part. However, the next part to talk about will be the timing, and I hope you look forward to that, because the timing is where it gets very technical.